Well, the ultimate championship saga of the summer is finally over, and it means some very early weekend work for us because despite the fact most of us have known since about Tuesday that this was going to happen, Burnley waited until 9:30 on a Friday night in the middle of a Euros quarter final to announce that Scott Parker, the eighth man to be an odds on favourite for the job this summer, is going to be the new head coach. He replaces Vincent Kompany, who I think it surprised everyone when Bayern Munich went for earlier this summer after relegation from the Premier League in 19th place. But Burnley confirmed Scott Parker, no mention of the length of contract in the statement, but widely reported to be 3 years as their new head coach as they look to bounce straight back to the Premier League at the first attempt. We will, of course, talk in quite a bit of detail about his appointment and what it means for Burnley this season a bit later on. But as always, first up, we talk about the old man at the helm, and that was Vincent Kompany. And should we say, it wasn't Burnley for 2 years, was it? It was Vincent Kompany's Burnley in the media. Maybe Burnley fans will be happy to get rid of that tag, I don't know. But Vincent Kompany's spell, I think, very much has to be divided into two, doesn't it? His first season in a championship where I think it would be fair to say no one really knew how he was going to go. He'd had a decent record at Anderlecht, he'd done okay. He'd rebuilt them at a difficult time, but never really shown the consistency to be a top team. And he came over to Burnley, and they had a slightly slower start, but we mentioned it in a prediction show most weeks. They were finding themselves very hard to beat. They were picking up a lot of draws, and they were staying in that mix. And then suddenly, they just hit form. They played brilliantly for a spell of about 25 games, and then towards the end of the season, they just became rock solid again. And it was a walk in the park, the championship for them. I know we had two very tight games with them at Luton, but they were a fantastic team. And actually, I remember Vincent Kompany in his second game getting a little bit of criticism because of that draw at home to Luton. And he said Luton will be a top six side, don't worry. And the rest is history. We both ended up going up. But what a performance it was. One of the best teams I've seen playing a championship in a long time. And it's a league, as you know, we follow very closely. They're enjoyable to watch. They played a very different brand of football to most teams in the championship. And it was preparing for Premier League football on the top level, wasn't it? Or so we thought, because once Burnley got promoted, for Vincent Kompany, it was maybe a bit of a surprise. And we've had many a debate about this on this channel, on the FM Twitch channel as well, in particular, with Burnley fans and with others, about the fact that Burnley walked the championship. They went up playing really good football with a good young side, and then they completely gutted it for the Premier League. They replaced so much of the squad. They brought in so many different players. And you look towards the end of the year, some of them actually got reversed. So you saw the likes of Muric come back in for Trafford towards the end of the season. And it was so much of a surprise to so many of us that Burnley, playing so well in the championship, hadn't given many of that team a chance. In the end, though, it proved to be a disappointing season because Burnley never really looked like surviving. There was a brief glimmer for both Burnley and us, probably 3, 4, 5 games before the end. But otherwise, it just didn't really happen. And the same mistakes were being made week after week because, look, they were being stubborn to a style. And maybe that's an ownership directive. We'll see with the new manager because he doesn't traditionally always play that way. But in the end, it just sort of felt like a side that had come up doing so well to then go down with a bit of a whimper. It just seemed a little disappointing. However, overall, I think you have to say Vincent Kompany's spell at Burnley was a positive one. The fact that Bayern Munich then came in for him maybe proved that sticking to his playing style was a benefit for him, more so than the football club even, because to be able to be picked by Bayern Munich after a relegation from the Premier League, there's not many managers who could pull that off. However, did a great job in a championship, produced a side that for a year was just an absolute joy to watch. And in the Premier League, it was disappointing, but I guess the argument, we have to be fair on the flip side of it, as Luton probably proved, you can play anyway in the Premier League. If you're a newly promoted club, 9 times out of 10, you're going to struggle. And that was the case with Burnley. However, it is back to the championship now. So let's move on to the new man, who I am baffled it has taken until July to get a replacement in. We've talked about this. It's kind of the situation where I don't think anyone in the footballing world, including those in the boardroom at Burnley, thought that after a relegation from the Premier League, their manager was going to be poached. I think they were getting ready to prepare for a new season with Kompany and were shocked as anyone when one of the biggest clubs in European football said, "Can we have your manager?" And it did kind of look like that, didn't we? As there was a huge number of different names at the top of the list and the top of the betting for who was going to be new manager. And then eventually, after pre-season's already started, we've got a new head coach. But weirdly, after signings had already come in, and more bizarrely, after a new assistant manager had been appointed, which is a little bit of a unique scenario, although we are starting to see that at other clubs now as well. But let's talk about Scott Parker, because Burnley Football Club say they are delighted to announce him as their new head coach. He arrives at Turf Moor with a proven managerial record after securing 2 promotions to the Premier League previously with Fulham and Bournemouth. There's lots of blurb, as you would always expect, and Scott Parker was very happy to be there, as he would be, after his last job went pretty disastrously at Club Brugge. Now, we're going to have to split this into a few separate parts, because the first one is definitely the role. Vincent Kompany was the Burnley manager. Scott Parker is the Burnley head coach. Does that represent a change in a football club? I don't really think it does hugely. I think it's perhaps just the remodelling of the coaching structure. He's not going to be picking his own assistant for sure, but I would imagine he's still going to have a fair say. So I'm not going to be too worried about that. The second element we've got to talk about is his history and his results. And the third part probably about playing style, because let's go back to the results. There is no doubting, as Burnley state in a statement, that there are 2 promotions on his CV from this division to the Premier League, which, as a manager who's fairly young in his career, he only started in 2019, that's not a bad effort, is it, in 5 or 6 years? He took Fulham up, he took Bournemouth up, and obviously both of those went really well in the Championship, much like Vincent Kompany. Very good Championship seasons, and then started to go wrong in the Premier League. Now, if we have a look at the Bournemouth stint in particular, the most recent one, we have to remember how it ended, because there was a lot of talk about Scott Parker, the personality there, which is a shame, because as a player, he was always incredibly popular. But he sort of built this thing, which is the reason probably this appointment has a mixed reaction. He's built this sort of persona that for football fans, particularly of his own club, maybe isn't that likeable. Neither Fulham or Bournemouth fans remember him particularly fondly, which is strange when he's taken them both up to the Premier League. However, if you look at the Bournemouth stint in particular, it obviously finished with that very famous flashpoint after the 9-0 defeat at Liverpool, where he did that post-match press conference, yes, probably full of emotion, where he just sort of said, I've not been backed. The players here aren't at a good enough level. I feel sorry for them because I don't think they can win games. And then obviously there were very few signings before the end of the window. Gary O'Neill took interim charge and kept them up incredibly comfortably, and they played some decent football on the way as well. Now, the thing that annoyed me about that with the Scott Parker one was, yes, you could argue looking at that summer work, he might be right. He wasn't backed hugely then. However, it was a bit of a dig at a board who, if we remember back to the January in the Championship, Bournemouth were having a little bit of a wobble. There was a threat to the top 2. They just lost at Luton in stoppage time with a 3-2 defeat, and they'd had a little bit of a sticky run where defensively they'd not been great. What the board did in that January was back him in preparation for the Premier League. They bought in 5 players. They played the likes of 9 million for Antoine Semenyo. They bought in Kiefer Moore, who is a promotion specialist from the Championship. They bought in several players that were going to take the club to the next level. And in a case of people like Semenyo, people who were for the future and may have been targets for the summer that were brought forward. So I think his accusations there are a little bit harsh. And obviously what's happened afterwards, particularly the rest of the season with Gary O'Neill, has then made him perhaps look a little bit foolish. If you combine that with what followed, which was a spell in Belgium which lasted 2.5 months and yielded 2 wins from 12 matches at one of the biggest clubs in Belgium, probably with the best squad on paper at the time, things don't look particularly good for Scott Parker in terms of optics and the way he's presented himself. But there is no doubting that overall, when he has managed in the Championship, he has been excellent. With Fulham, a 35% win rate overall, but a promotion to the Premier League, and actually a 50% win rate with Bournemouth because he left just after the Premier League season started. So in the Championship, he wins games and he gets teams promoted, which is what ultimately Burnley want this year. But if we move that towards the playing style, that's where it perhaps comes a bit more of a surprise, because I mentioned one of the signings that Bournemouth made in that January in Kiefer Moore. And if you remember a game towards the end of the season against Forest, they were playing sort of smash and grab football on the counter-attack. It wasn't a team that were always stylish. It wasn't a team that were always brilliant. And if you go back to Fulham as well, Alexander Mitrovic in the attack was a bit of a linchpin and they were scoring goals for fun yet again. He's relied on having a big target man and playing directly into the box. Now, I have no problem with that. Football can be entertaining whether it's direct or passed along the floor. I don't really care. But it's a very big departure on paper from the way that Vincent Kompany played with Burnley. And that's potentially presenting problems at the club. We go back to ones with Southampton last year, for example. Yes, Russell Martin in the end did really well, got them promoted. But the start to the season was incredibly slow because they'd gone through Ruben Selles, Nathan Jones, Ralph Hasenhüttl in the previous year. Three completely different styles of football. And while Russell Martin in the end built his own, got to the playoffs, got promoted, you remember a lot of the fans wanted him out in September or October because they were losing and conceding 4 or 5 every week. Now, with Scott Parker, if there's going to be a change in style and quite a significant one, is he going to be able to do that quickly? Or was it purely the resources he had there? Because if you've got a Fulham team in a championship with Mitrovic, of course you're going to play to his strengths. If you're bringing Keith Moore in a January window, perhaps you're going to do the same. So maybe we're judging him unfairly there and he will adapt to this team. But the Burnley side is a very different one to the one that went up 2 years ago. And I know Burnley are still the second favourites for promotion after Leeds because people are saying, well, look at what they did last time they were in the championship. But a lot of those players have moved on and continue to move on. We've seen even this summer people like Charlie Taylor leaving on a free to go to Southampton. And we've seen a few signings as well. It does leave us asking a few questions. And I'm really intrigued actually to see what style of football he plays here. His teams, regardless of how they play compared to Kompany, score goals at a similar rate. I just wonder if there's any damage from that Club Brugge spell, but I'm not sure there will be. And the reason I mention that slow start and the reason I mention the style of football is because the first 5 games are not the best on paper for Burnley if you've got a new manager and you're settling in. And let's not forget, we mentioned it last year with Sheffield Wednesday at the other end of the table in a different battle. He's going to be playing catch-up coming in at the point he's joined. He's coming in with 5 weeks to go to the season, into the pre-season. You look at other clubs in that promotion mix. I take Luton, my club, as the example again. They've been back a week and a half, as of Burnley, but without the head coach. And that can sometimes be a little bit strange. But in their first 5 games, I will actually see Scott Parker's first competitive game in charge because it's away at Luton on Monday Night Football. And then 3 games later, they're away at Leeds United. So the other 2 teams that are the 3 favourites for promotion with them, they're visiting in the first 5 weeks. Both on TV, both in front of the national audience. And you do worry that if he has poor performances, fans won't say, oh, you're playing 2 of the 3 favourites, it's all right. They might say, well, we've lost 2 of our first 5 games, what's going on? So there is a bit of a pressure on Scott Parker. Because if he can get through those first 5 games, and of course he's playing people in a similar situation there as well. Sunderland with a bit of an unknown quantity as a manager appointment. That's in August too. And they've got home games against Cardiff and the big one against Blackburn. So that first 5 games, if you lose to Luton and Leeds and you don't win the Lancashire derby, do you then come under pressure already? Hopefully for his sake he can get through that because after it, you've got a run of what you would call quite friendly fixtures on paper. 2 of the promoted clubs in succession and Plymouth at home, who have been ridiculed for appointing Wayne Rooney and only just survived last season. So there is an opportunity if he gets through that spell to have a really good September, October and get Burnley off to that positive start. But the first 5 games I feel are going to define the tenure. I said this when Wayne Rooney came in at Birmingham to sack a manager in the playoffs. And then you've got those 5 stinkers of games at the start. If you don't win them, you're under pressure. And for Scott Parker, he's following an incredibly popular manager who walked the championship last time he was in there with Burnley. They've spent loads of money in the Premier League. Yes, they've come back down, but they've still got a great young squad. They've still got one of the best teams in the division. They've still got quality all over the park. Even when you're playing 2 of the 3 fellow promotion favourites and you're playing in the derby against a side that, by the way, survived on the final day last year, the expectation from the fans is going to be win and promotion. And the expectation of the board is surely going to be promotion or bust. I can't see a way in which Scott Parker doesn't get promoted and stays in his job. And that's going to be the difficult thing for him here. Because if he doesn't get off to a positive start, given the persona he's had at his recent clubs, and the fact that he does get a little bit emotional and irrational at times in interviews, it could lead him into a bad situation. So that's my only worry. I actually think if he gets through that okay, I think they'll go on to have a good season at Burnley. And with the squad they've got, with his championship record, and with the backing that the ownership group seem to give, I think they're a real shoo-in for a top 6 place and quite possibly the battle for the top 2. Whether or not they'll get in there or not will probably depend on signings the rest of the summer and quite possibly on which players Leeds lose, which I think is what us and Burnley are both looking at. However, on paper, I have to say that as long as he gets through the first 5 games, I think Scott Parker will be absolutely fine. But just because of the way the fixtures have fallen, there is a real suggestion he could be under some pressure come mid-September, and it's going to be important that he gets off to a positive start and maybe that he just produces results in those games rather than exemplary performances. But before we finish off very quickly, we normally ask two questions at the end of these manager specials. Will the manager see out their contract, and how will the team do this season? My thought is Burnley, with the squad they've got, they can't miss out on a top six. I do worry about him in those early matches, and I hope from a Luton point of view that, no disrespect, they lose the first one. However, after that, I do think Burnley are going to be in the mix. Definitely top six. I think they'll be in the battle for the top two. If I'm completely honest with you, I see this as a season where you've got 3 or 4 teams battling for the top two. A bit like last season for a large part, and 2 are going to miss out. I think Middlesbrough are going to sneak into that mix. There's an early preview for my predictions for this season. But ultimately, whether it's top 2 or not will probably be decided by the transfers that are made. Part of me at the moment would say it's going to be a battle between 2nd and 3rd for Burnley. But a few signings and a positive start, and that can change very quickly. In terms of seeing out the contract, I think the suggestion is always no in football these days. Yes, if he gets promoted, he'll stay in his job. Will he keep his toys in the pram when it comes to Premier League football? Based on what we saw with Kompany, he's going to get backed. He's going to get money to spend. He's going to have to be sensible with it. And ultimately, the scattergun approach we saw at Bournemouth, which just about paid off in the end, may not be the way forward for him. But how much of a say he's going to have in that transfer policy, I'm not quite sure. So I don't think he'll see out the 3 years, but I do think Burnley will be a real promotion contender this year. I think under most managers they would have been. But Scott Parker's championship record is very, very good. So as long as he gets through those early headache matches, I think Burnley are going to have a very good season. But ultimately, doesn't really matter what I think, does it? We've seen a slightly mixed reaction, possibly because of his personality and the way he's come across in the media, more than his actual results in the championship. But Burnley fans, what do you think? Are you happy with the appointment? Are you relieved to just finally have someone in? And do you think this appointment will lead to a promotion this year, the playoffs, or do you sense a little bit of trouble? I don't think you will have personally. I think a top 6 finish is almost secured, provided no disasters. And then the top 2 is just the big question, isn't it? Let me know what you think about the Scott Parker appointment and your season ahead. If you enjoyed this one, please do put a thumbs up on the video and subscribe to the podcast for regular content. We will be back in just a few weeks' time now with all of our pre-season predictions for promotion, relegation and the playoffs across the EFL and the National League. We'll also have championship predictions every single match day, just as we did last season. So make sure you turn that notification bell on, stay up to date with all of it, and come and get involved because we play a little bit of a friendly semi-competitive quiz every week with it. Hopefully I'll see you for those, but in the meantime, you can find some of our other summer manager specials from the championship up in the eye above, as well as special interviews and a few other bits too. The likes of Plymouth with Wayne Rooney, Sunderland recently with Regis Labrie, our thoughts on all of those up in the eye above. We're also going to be doing championship watch-along live streams for the first ever time this season, so come and get involved with those if you can as well. But for now, thank you very much for watching. Good luck to Burnley with their new manager, apart from the opening day of the season. We'll see you back here again soon as the 24-25 season kicks off in the EFL Championship.